Ladies and gentlemen, before our first dance, I've arranged some entertainment. Preston Whitmore III gestured toward the service entrance with his champagne flute, smirking at the pregnant black woman in the cheap black dress. Some of you might remember Tanya. She used to keep me company. His eyes dropped to her belly. I thought it would be amusing to let her sing one last time, before she gets too busy with her little situation. Laughter rippled through the ballroom. Phones came out. Someone whispered, "Is that the black girl who thought she could trap a Whitmore?" Another snorted, "Pathetic." 500 guests, crystal chandeliers, designer gowns worth more than her yearly salary. And Tanya Adams stood alone. No one defended her. Not one. But none of them knew this. The woman they were laughing at had spent 8 months writing a song about the man in the tuxedo, and in 11 minutes she would open her mouth, and 500 people would forget how to breathe. 18 months earlier, Tanya Adams was just a girl with a voice and a dream that felt smaller every day. Every night she sang at Delilah's Jazz Lounge, a cramped club in downtown Detroit that her late father had helped build with his bare hands 30 years ago. The walls were cracked and yellowed with age. The piano was perpetually out of tune, no matter how many times old Mr. Henderson came to fix it. The tip jar behind the bar rarely held more than $40 on a good night. The neighborhood had changed around the club. Gentrification crept closer every year, pushing out the families who had lived there for generations. But Delilah's remained, a stubborn monument to a time when jazz meant something, when music was more than content for algorithms. When Tanya opened her mouth to sing, none of that mattered anymore. Her voice was the kind that made strangers stop mid-conversation and forget what they were saying. The kind that made grown men cry into their whiskey without understanding why. The kind that could fill every corner of a room without needing a microphone, as if the air itself wanted to carry her sound. She always wore her grandmother's locket, a small gold oval, tarnished with age, that she touched before every single performance without fail. Inside was a faded photograph of a woman with Tanya's same dark eyes and 5 words engraved in delicate cursive: "Sing the truth, even when it hurts." Her grandmother had been a singer too. Never famous, never rich. But she'd sung in churches and at funerals and at weddings for 50 years, and everyone who heard her said the same thing. That woman could make God himself weep. Tanya inherited that voice, and the locket, and the belief that music could change things. Every night after her last set, when the customers had stumbled home and the bartender was counting receipts, Tanya would sit in the corner booth with a cup of cold coffee and write in a small leather notebook. Song lyrics. Unfinished verses. Words she couldn't say out loud to anyone. That notebook would become the most important thing she ever owned. Preston Whitmore III walked into Delilah's Jazz Lounge on a Thursday night in October. He was slumming. That's what his Harvard Business School friends called it when they ventured into neighborhoods that smelled like reality instead of old money. They came in loud, already half drunk on expensive whiskey they'd consumed at some rooftop bar downtown. They ordered more whiskey they didn't bother to appreciate and laughed too loud at jokes that weren't funny. Preston didn't notice the club, didn't notice the photographs of jazz legends covering the walls behind the bar, didn't notice the history soaked into every water-stained ceiling tile. He noticed nothing at all until Tanya started to sing. She was performing Strange Fruit that night, Billie Holiday's haunting protest song. It wasn't a crowd pleaser. It wasn't meant to be. But Tanya sang it because her grandmother had sung it, and her grandmother's mother had sung it, and some songs needed to be remembered. Preston stopped mid-sentence, his glass frozen halfway to his lips. For 3 full songs, he didn't move, didn't blink. His friends kept talking around him, but he heard nothing except her voice. He didn't fall in love with her that night. Men like Preston Whitmore III don't fall in love. They acquire. They collect things that make them feel special: rare watches, vintage cars, paintings by artists whose names they can't pronounce. A voice that could make a room stand still was simply another collectible. He wanted to own that voice. It took him 2 months to wear her down. Flowers delivered to the club every night. Gifts she couldn't afford to refuse. Promises wrapped in silk and delivered with a smile that seemed so genuine she couldn't see the calculations behind it. He told her she was beautiful. He told her she was talented. He told her he'd never met anyone like her in his entire life. And then he told her she was his secret. "You're my beautiful secret," he whispered one night, stroking her hair in his penthouse apartment that overlooked the city like a throne room. "I want to keep you all to myself." Tanya thought it was romantic. She thought it meant she was special, too precious to share with the world. It took her 14 months to realize it was a cage. He never introduced her to his family, never allowed a single photograph of them together, never held her hand in public or acknowledged her existence to anyone who mattered. She was always the shadow, never permitted near the spotlight. And he made her quit singing. "Why perform for strangers when you can sing just for me?" he said with that smile she once thought was charming. She didn't recognize the chains until they were already locked tight around her throat. Then she got pregnant. Tanya told him with trembling hands and eyes full of desperate hope. This would change everything, she was certain. He would finally introduce her to his family. They would finally be real. They would finally begin the life he'd been promising her for over a year. Preston's face went cold. "You actually thought this was going somewhere?" He laughed. Not a warm laugh, but the kind that cuts through flesh and bone. "Tanya, you were a phase. A palate cleanser before the main course. I'm marrying Clarissa Pemberton Hayes next spring. A senator's daughter, someone from my actual world." He slid a check across the marble table. $100,000. "Handle it, or keep it. I genuinely don't care which. But sign this NDA and disappear from my life forever." Tanya refused. And Preston Whitmore III made her pay for that decision every single day for the next 8 months. Her life collapsed piece by piece, as if invisible hands were dismantling everything she'd ever built. She lost her apartment. Preston's shell company, she later discovered, owned the entire building. Delilah's Jazz Lounge got hit with health inspection after health inspection. Anonymous complaints about noise violations, threats of closure that seemed to multiply like cancer. Every venue in Detroit suddenly had no openings for a pregnant black singer with no connections and no representation. She ended up working the night shift as a receptionist at a 24-hour medical clinic, answering phones and filing paperwork while her feet swelled and her back ached and her dreams gathered dust. But every night in her tiny studio apartment with the radiator that clanked and the neighbor who played television too loud, Tanya wrote, not letters she would never send, not diary entries full of self-pity, a song about the man who called her his beautiful secret before turning her into his shameful problem, about the baby he refused to acknowledge, about the 14 months of whispered promises that meant absolutely nothing, about the nights she sang to the walls because no one else would listen anymore. She wrote that song 51 times, editing, rewriting, perfecting every word until each syllable was a weapon. Then, 3 weeks before his wedding, Preston Whitmore III sent her an invitation. Not a real invitation to attend as a guest. A performance contract. $500 to sing at his wedding to Clarissa Pemberton Hayes, the senator's daughter. $500. The exact amount he had once tipped her, as a joke, the very first night they met at Delilah's. The note attached read, "I thought it would be nice to give you one last chance to sing in front of people who actually matter." And that's when Tanya Adams realized something important. This wasn't just humiliation. This was an opportunity. The contract arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Tanya sat at her tiny kitchen table, a folding card table she'd bought at a thrift store for $12, staring at the document like it might burst into flames. Her hands rested on her belly, feeling the baby kick against her palm. She was 7 months along now, and every movement reminded her of what was at stake. She almost threw the contract away, almost crumpled it into a ball and tossed it into the garbage can with the takeout containers and the unpaid bills. Almost. But something made her read the fine print first. Years of signing performance contracts at clubs and festivals had taught her to check every clause, every paragraph, every bit of legal language that promoters tried to slip past exhausted artists. And there it was, buried deep in paragraph 7, section B. Performer agrees to 1. Song selection of client's choosing, with the option of 1 additional song selection at performer's discretion, subject to venue acoustic limitations. Preston's lawyers were so arrogant, so confident in his absolute power over her, that they hadn't bothered to modify the standard entertainment contract. They had given her a weapon without even realizing it. She had the legal right to sing a second song, any song she wanted, and there was nothing Preston Whitmore III could do about it. The next morning, she found an envelope that had been slid under her door sometime during the night. No return address, no postmark, no signature. Just a single sheet of paper with 4 names written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Rebecca Moore, Lauren Mitchell, Jasmine Howard, Diana Torres. And below them, a single line that made Tanya's blood run cold. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. If you have the courage to sing, they will hear. Someone who was once exactly where you are. Tanya stared at those names for a long time. She didn't recognize any of them, had no idea who they were or what connected them to Preston Whitmore. But something in her gut, the same instinct that had made her refuse the $100,000, the same instinct that made her keep writing that song night after night, told her she needed to find out. That night she called a phone number she hadn't dialed in almost 2 years. Mama Tony answered on the second ring like she'd been waiting. Antoinette. Mama Tony Williams was 67 years old, with silver hair she refused to dye and hands that still remembered every piano chord she'd ever learned. She had been a backup singer for Aretha Franklin in the 70s. She had performed at the Apollo Theater 17 times. She had taught Tanya everything she knew about using her voice as something more than entertainment, as a weapon. I need to sing a song, Tanya said without preamble, and it needs to be the most memorable performance of my entire life. There was silence on the line. Then, sing it for me. Tanya closed her eyes and sang the song she had written 51 times. When she finished, she could hear Mama Tony crying softly through the phone. Baby girl, the old woman finally whispered. That song is going to change everything. Are you absolutely certain you're ready for what comes after? Tanya looked at the paper with the 4 names. Rebecca, Lauren, Jasmine, Diana. She looked at her belly, feeling the baby kick again. I've been silent for 14 months, she said. I'm not being silent anymore. In the week before the wedding, Tanya Adams prepared for war. Mama Tony met her every day at the old community center on Gratiot Avenue, where the floors creaked and the mirrors were cracked, but the acoustics were surprisingly decent. They worked for hours on technique, on breath control, on projection, all the fundamentals Tanya had neglected during her 14 months of being Preston Whitmore's hidden secret. But there was one thing Mama Tony taught her that would matter more than everything else combined. The hold. It was an ancient technique, circular breathing, the kind that opera singers and jazz legends used to sustain a note far beyond what seemed humanly possible. You learn to inhale through your nose while simultaneously pushing air out through your mouth using your cheek muscles. It took years to master properly. Tanya had 1 week. Aretha could hold for 25 seconds, Mama Tony said, demonstrating the technique. Whitney could do 28 on her best nights. She leaned forward, her dark eyes sharp as knives. If you can hold for 30, no one in that room will ever forget you. Not for the rest of their natural lives. Tanya practiced until her lungs burned and her diaphragm cramped, and stars danced at the edges of her vision. She practiced until her neighbors complained. She practiced until her throat was raw. 20 seconds. 25. 28. 30. She could do it. Mama Tony also made a phone call to her niece, Denise, a wedding planner who, by convenient coincidence, happened to be working the Whitmore-Pemberton wedding. "My niece will keep an eye on you," Mama Tony promised. "You won't be completely alone in that ballroom." And there was also Derek Webb, a sound engineer Tanya had worked with at a music festival in Atlanta 3 years earlier. She had covered for him when a technical mistake nearly got him fired, lied to the promoter, and took the blame herself. Derek had sworn he would repay the favor someday. Now he was running sound for the Whitmore wedding. "I owe you," Derek said when she called him. "Tell me what you need. I need you to record everything that happens, every single second. And if anyone tries to cut my microphone—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Let it happen." "Let it happen? Are you sure?" "Trust me. I have a plan." The night before the wedding, Tanya stood alone in her cramped apartment. She opened her grandmother's locket with trembling fingers and placed a small folded piece of paper inside. The lyrics to her song, written in handwriting so tiny it was almost illegible. "If I forget the words," she whispered to her grandmother's photograph, "you'll remind me." She closed the locket, touched it to her lips, pressed it against her heart. Then she sang the entire song one final time, completely alone in the darkness of her apartment. When she reached the end, the final note, the 30-second hold that would make or break everything, the walls seemed to vibrate around her. The glasses in her cabinet rattled softly. She stopped, breathed, waited for her heart to slow. And for the first time in 8 months, Tanya Adams smiled. Preston Whitmore thought he was hiring a broken woman to humiliate in front of his wealthy friends. He was about to meet the storm he had created. The Whitmore estate was everything Tanya had expected, and somehow even worse. The main house sat on 47 acres of manicured grounds outside Detroit, a monument to old money and older privilege. The ballroom alone could have fit her entire apartment building inside it, with room to spare. 60-foot cathedral ceilings soared overhead, designed 2 centuries ago by architects who understood that sound was sacred. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls of light, each one worth more than she would earn in a decade. The flower arrangements, peonies and roses and orchids flown in from 3 different continents, totaled $2.3 million, and 500 guests looked at Tanya Adams like she was something unfortunate stuck to the bottom of their Italian leather shoes. She entered through the service entrance as instructed, past the dumpsters overflowing with catering waste, past the staff unloading cases of champagne that cost more per bottle than her monthly rent, past the security guards in their dark suits who smirked as she walked by, making no effort to hide their contempt. One of them muttered to another, "That's the entertainment? Thought this was supposed to be a classy event." Tanya kept walking. Her hand found the locket at her throat. In the storage room where they told her to wait. Not a green room, not a dressing room, a literal storage room filled with cleaning supplies and extra tablecloths. She could hear the reception through the thin walls. Laughter and clinking glasses and music from a string quartet, playing something elegant and completely soulless. The door opened without warning. Clarissa Pemberton Hayes stood in the doorway, framed by light from the hallway like an angel made of spite. Her Vera Wang wedding dress had cost $52,000. Tanya had looked it up online, torturing herself with the details. Every stitch was perfect. Every bead was hand-sewn. Clarissa's eyes swept over Tanya with the kind of look usually reserved for insects discovered in expensive food. "Oh my God." Clarissa turned to her bridesmaids with a delighted little smile, as if she'd just discovered something hilarious. "She actually came. Preston said she would, but honestly, I didn't believe him." Her gaze dropped to Tanya's belly, lingering there with undisguised disdain. Poor thing, clearly someone didn't plan ahead. The bridesmaids giggled on cue, a chorus of trained cruelty. Tanya said nothing. She just touched her locket and waited for them to leave. At 7:47 p.m., they came to collect her. 500 guests turned to stare as a pregnant black woman in a simple black dress walked to the center of the most expensive ballroom in Michigan. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowd like poison through water. The MC read from a prepared card. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Preston Whitmore III has arranged a very special surprise for this evening." And then Preston gave his little speech, the one about entertainment, about how amusing it would be, about someone like her getting to perform in a room like this. The laughter that followed was the cruelest sound Tanya had ever heard. The pianist, a young man in a tuxedo who had been given very specific instructions, began playing the introduction to At Last. It was Etta James's classic love song, the one that played at weddings and romantic movies and moments of genuine joy. Preston had chosen it deliberately. He wanted Tanya to sing about finding love at last while standing alone and pregnant at his wedding to another woman. The irony was supposed to be the joke. Tanya didn't sing. The pianist played the intro again, and again. His fingers stumbled slightly, confused. "Is there a problem?" Preston called out from the head table, clearly enjoying himself immensely. "Did you forget the words?" Laughter rippled through the ballroom again. Tanya lifted her chin. "I'm changing the song." The room went quiet. "The contract specifies that I get to choose one song myself," she said, her voice clear and unwavering despite the 500 hostile faces staring at her. "I'm using that right now, for the first song." Preston's smile flickered, then steadied. "That's not how—" Paragraph 7, Section B. Tanya held up her phone, displaying a photograph of the contract. "One song of your choosing, one of mine. Would you like me to read the specific language out loud, in front of all your guests?" Silence stretched across the ballroom like a held breath. Preston's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he was aware of 500 pairs of eyes watching him, 500 phones ready to record any outburst. He had an image to maintain. He waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, one song, make it quick." Tanya signaled to Derek Webb at the sound booth. A different piano track began playing through the speakers. Not At Last. Not anything anyone in that room had ever heard before. Something new. Something written in darkness and solitude over 51 drafts. "This song is called Beautiful Secret," Tanya announced. "I wrote it myself." She looked directly at Preston Whitmore III. "And it's for the man who's about to get married." The murmuring intensified. Confused glances were exchanged. Phones emerged from pockets and purses. Tanya touched her grandmother's locket one final time. She closed her eyes. She drew a breath from the deepest part of her diaphragm, exactly the way Mama Tony had drilled into her for hours, and she opened her mouth. The first note. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic or showy or designed to impress. Just a single note. One pure sound rising from her throat into the air. But it rang. The cathedral ceiling, 60 feet of acoustic perfection, designed by craftsmen who understood that some sounds were sacred, caught her voice like a loving hand, amplified it, carried it to every corner of that massive ballroom without losing a single vibration. And something extraordinary happened. Preston Whitmore's smirk died on his face. Not faded, not diminished, died. As if someone had reached inside him and simply switched it off. Clarissa Pemberton Hayes stopped whispering to her maid of honor mid-sentence, her mouth still open, but no words emerging. A man at table 7 had been raising a champagne glass to his lips. His arm froze in mid-motion, the crystal flute suspended in empty air, completely forgotten. The pianist's hands stopped on the keys, paralyzed. A woman in the front row dropped her clutch purse. Not fumbled it, not juggled it, simply dropped it because she had forgotten she was holding anything at all. Security guards who had been moving toward Tanya stopped mid-step, their professional composure shattered by something they couldn't name. But it wasn't just a few people scattered through the room. Not 10, not 50, not even 100. All 500. From the billionaires at the VIP tables to the catering staff along the walls. From the United States Senator to the bartender refilling champagne. From the bride in her $52,000 gown to the busboy who had paused with a stack of dirty plates. Every single person in that ballroom. Frozen. In one collective instant. 3 seconds. One note. And 500 people forgot where they were. This wasn't merely good. This wasn't impressive or talented or any of the inadequate words critics use to describe voices. This was transcendent. This was the voice that Preston Whitmore III had heard 18 months ago in a rundown jazz club and thought to himself, I want to own this. He had never understood, never could have understood. You don't own something like this. You survive it, if you're lucky. Tanya opened her eyes. The room was still frozen around her, and she began to sing. You called me your beautiful secret, kept me hidden like a shameful thing. 14 months of whispered promises while you wore another woman's ring. Her voice wove through the ballroom like silk wrapped around a razor blade, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Every word was crystal clear, every syllable deliberately chosen. This wasn't performance, this was testimony. The guests who had been laughing just moments before weren't laughing anymore. Their faces shifted from amused to confused to deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Those who knew the rumors started putting pieces together. 14 months? A secret relationship? While he was engaged? You said not yet, not yet, not yet. My family wouldn't understand. But I understand now, darling. I was never part of your plan. Preston shot to his feet. This is absolutely ridiculous. But his voice couldn't compete. The cathedral ceiling wasn't on his side. It was on hers. He spoke. No one heard. She sang. Everyone listened. Then came the second verse, and the revelation that would shatter everything. When I told you about our baby, you looked at me like I was dirt. Handle it, you said, or disappear. Like I was trash that needed to be hurt. You offered money for my silence, 100,000 for my shame. But some things can't be bought, darling. And now everyone knows your name. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom like a physical wave. 500 people had just heard, through a song, through a voice that seemed to resonate inside their very bones, that Preston Whitmore III had kept a secret girlfriend for 14 months, that she was pregnant with his child, that he had offered her $100,000 to make the problem disappear, that the baby was his. Clarissa shot to her feet so quickly her chair crashed backwards. Her wedding dress swept the floor as she spun toward Preston. Preston, is this true? He couldn't answer. He literally couldn't form words, because Tanya was still singing, and the truth was filling every corner of the room like floodwater, impossible to stop or contain. And in the far corner of the ballroom, a brown-haired woman in an expensive dress, someone nobody had particularly noticed before, was crying silently into her hands, not tears of sympathy or emotion, tears of recognition. She knew this song, because she had lived it. Victoria Whitmore sat at the head table, her expression carved from marble. She was 67 years old, the same age as Mama Tony, though the two women might as well have been from different planets. Victoria had built and protected the Whitmore empire through 3 recessions, 2 hostile takeover attempts, and 1 very expensive divorce. She knew how to handle problems. She watched her son's wedding disintegrate in real time, and she made a decision. She leaned toward the string quartet leader, a young man she had personally hired for this event, and whispered 4 words into his ear. He nodded once. His hand moved toward the secondary control panel that managed the backup sound system, the one only staff knew about. Preston caught the signal from his mother. For the first time since Tanya had started singing, something resembling hope crossed his face. "I'm not your beautiful secret. Not anymore. Not today. I'm standing here before your world, and I've got something to say. You tried to silence me, darling, tried to make me disappear, but I found my voice again, and now everyone can hear." Click. The sound system cut out completely. The microphone went dead. The backing track disappeared into nothing. Sudden, violent, absolute silence. Tanya stood alone in the center of 500 people with no amplification, no music, nothing but the pounding of her own heart. Preston's voice rang out triumphantly in the sudden quiet. "Oops, looks like we're having some technical difficulties." He was grinning now, his confidence restored. "Security? I think the show is over. Please escort her out." 2 large men in dark suits began moving toward Tanya from opposite sides of the room. This was the moment Preston had been waiting for all along. The pregnant black woman humiliated and physically removed from his wedding reception in front of everyone who mattered. The perfect punchline to his perfect joke. Tanya didn't run. She didn't cry. She didn't beg or plead or look around desperately for help. She took a breath, deep, from her diaphragm, engaging every technique Mama Tony had drilled into her over the past week. And she sang, without the microphone. Her voice should have disappeared in a room that large. 500 guests, 60-foot ceilings, no electronic amplification whatsoever. But the cathedral ceiling caught her voice like a prayer rising to heaven, because that's what it was designed to do. 2 centuries ago, this ballroom had been built for worship, for voices that needed to reach God himself. Tanya's voice reached further, raw, unfiltered, more powerful without the microphone than it had ever been with one. "You thought you broke me, baby. Took my home, took my stage. But you forgot one thing, darling. You can't put a voice in a cage. I'm not your beautiful secret. Not anymore. Not today. I'm standing here before your world, and I've got something to say." The security guards stopped moving, not because anyone ordered them to, but because 500 phones were now recording. 500 witnesses were watching, and anyone who laid hands on a pregnant woman singing her heart out would become the villain in a video that would circle the globe by morning. At the sound booth, Derek Webb quietly activated the network of hidden wireless speakers he had positioned throughout the room, not to amplify Tanya's voice, but to capture it and relay it clearly to every corner of the ballroom. He didn't really need to. The natural acoustics were doing most of the work. But Derek was a professional, and he believed in backup plans. Something shifted in the room. One person stood up, not to leave, to listen better. Then another. A woman from the catering staff, someone who had probably never been noticed by a single guest in her entire career, set down her serving tray, clasped her hands together over her heart, and stood at attention, bearing witness. Then another server, and another. Jerome Washington, a distinguished black man in an expensive tailored suit who had been sitting quietly in a corner table all evening, rose to his feet with dignified grace. His phone was still recording. It had been recording since the moment Tanya first opened her mouth. Within 30 seconds, a third of the room was standing. Not for Preston Whitmore III. For her. The tide was turning. Preston's face had lost all color. He was watching his own wedding reception transform into something else entirely. Watching 500 people slowly, inexorably shift their attention and their allegiance to a pregnant woman in a $40 dress. He had money. He had power. He had lawyers and connections and 4 generations of inherited privilege. But he had nothing. Nothing that could stop this. Nothing that could counter a voice telling the truth. Tanya reached the bridge of the song, Her voice was growing raw from singing without amplification, pushing sound from the deepest part of her diaphragm. Her body ached in ways she couldn't catalog. 7 months pregnant, standing under hot lights, pouring absolutely everything she had into every single note. She should have collapsed by now. Any reasonable person would have. But she had one more thing left to give. She looked directly at Preston Whitmore III, meeting his eyes across the crowded ballroom. He was pale now, sweating through his custom-tailored tuxedo. His mother was whispering frantically into his ear, but he wasn't listening. He couldn't look away from Tanya, and Tanya was looking at him like she could see every lie he had ever told. She opened her mouth, and she hit the note. A single, sustained note. It started soft, almost gentle. Then it built, and built, and built. Not louder, resonant, like the sound was vibrating inside their bones, inside their chests, inside the deepest parts of their skulls. 5 seconds passed. People started realizing she wasn't going to stop. 10 seconds. The guests who were standing began to sit down again. Not because they were tired, because their legs simply wouldn't hold them anymore. 15 seconds. Nobody in the room was breathing. Literally. 500 people were unconsciously holding their breath without even realizing they were doing it. 20 seconds. A woman in the third row started crying. She had no idea why. The tears just came. 25 seconds. Preston Whitmore's face underwent a transformation. The anger drained away. The contempt evaporated. In its place was something he had probably never felt before in his entire privileged life. Terror. Because he was watching something he couldn't buy, couldn't control, couldn't threaten or manipulate or destroy. Something that existed completely beyond his reach. 30 seconds. Tanya stopped. Absolute silence. 1 second passed. 2, 3, 4, 5 full seconds of complete, total, breathless silence. Not a cough, not a whisper, not a single intake of air. Then someone in the back of the room gasped loudly, a desperate, drowning sound like a swimmer finally breaking the surface, and the entire ballroom exhaled at once. 500 people had literally forgotten how to breathe for 35 seconds. Tanya stood there in the center of it all, sweat-soaked, trembling, 7 months pregnant, but standing. And then the applause began. Not polite golf claps, not scattered appreciation, a roar. Not a third of the room, not half, almost everyone. Even people who had been laughing at her 15 minutes ago. Even people who had come as Preston's personal guests. They weren't standing because they supported her cause. They weren't standing because they had suddenly developed moral convictions. They were standing because their bodies gave them no other choice. That was the power of the voice. For 2 solid minutes, the applause refused to stop. Tanya stood at the center of the ballroom, one hand resting on her belly, tears streaming freely down her face. But she wasn't crying from sadness anymore. She was crying because for the first time in 18 months, she had been truly heard. Preston Whitmore III was no longer at the head table. He had retreated to a far corner of the room where Clarissa was screaming at him, her $52,000 wedding dress bunched in her trembling fists. The words, secret and pregnant and how could you, echoed through the chaos. Senator Harold Pemberton, Clarissa's father, a man who had built his political career on family values and moral integrity, stood nearby with his phone pressed to his ear, his face the color of old granite. He was already calling his lawyers. Victoria Whitmore remained seated at the head table, absolutely motionless, staring at Tanya with an expression that defied interpretation. And then Preston grabbed a microphone from the DJ booth and strode toward the center of the room, his voice cutting through the lingering applause like a machete. Okay. He forced a laugh that sounded almost convincing. Very impressive. She's clearly got some talent, I'll give her that. But let's all remember, this is a performance, people. Entertainment. She's a singer. She gets paid to be dramatic. He spread his hands in a gesture of wounded reasonableness. Nothing in that song is real. These are the fabrications of a disturbed woman who couldn't accept that our brief relationship was over. That's when Denise stepped forward. Mama Tony's niece, the wedding planner who was supposed to be watching out for Tanya, the inside woman who was supposed to be her ally. She was holding a manila folder. Actually, Denise said, her voice cutting cleanly through the murmurs, I can confirm some things. Tanya's heart surged with desperate hope. An ally. Finally. Someone on her side with actual evidence. I have documents, Denise continued, moving toward the center of the room. Proof about Tanya and Preston. Tanya nearly smiled through her tears. Denise, thank you. Thank you so... But Denise didn't hand the folder to Tanya. She handed it directly to Preston. Here's everything she has, Denise said, her voice cold and professional. All the messages she saved, the photos she kept hidden. I copied them from her cloud storage 2 weeks ago. She turned to face Tanya, and there was nothing in her eyes but calculation. Did you really think I was on your side? Preston hired me 6 months ago to watch you, to get close to you, to find out exactly what kind of evidence you might try to use against him. The floor dropped out from under Tanya's world. Preston's confidence returned like a wave crashing onto shore. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what stalkers do. They obsess. They collect what they call evidence. They construct elaborate narratives to support their delusions. He held up the folder like a trophy. I have documentation showing that this woman followed me for 8 months after our relationship ended, showed up at my office, called me constantly, sent dozens of desperate text messages. That song? Pure fiction, a fantasy she invented to cope with rejection. And the baby? He shrugged with theatrical helplessness. I seriously doubt it's mine. But even if it is, does that excuse this kind of obsessive, destructive behavior? Tanya's voice cracked. You know it's your baby. You offered me $100,000 to... To what? Preston raised an eyebrow. Proof? Do you have actual proof of that? Recordings? Documents? He gestured at the folder in his hand. Or do you just have a song? The room shifted again. Whispered conversations rippled through the crowd. She does seem a little obsessed. Poor Preston, dealing with this on his wedding day. Beautiful voice, but maybe she's just creating drama. Tanya stood alone in the center of 500 people. Her song had filled every corner of this room, had made them forget to breathe, had exposed the truth. But it was just a song. She had no recordings, no lawyers, no evidence that would hold up in any court. She had lost. And then the pain hit. She doubled over with a gasp, both hands clutching her belly. Oh, God! Clear fluid splashed onto the marble floor. She's going into labor! A doctor rushed forward from one of the guest tables. This is premature. 7 months. She needs a hospital right now! Preston didn't miss a single beat. See? Drama right until the very end. She'll do absolutely anything to stay at the center of attention. Tanya looked up at him through the agony, unable to form words. She was in labor, premature labor, being called a liar and a stalker and a fraud, surrounded by 500 people who were starting to believe it. All was lost. In the chaos of the moment, a single voice cut through everything. She's not lying. Every head in the ballroom turned. Rebecca Moore was on her feet. The brown-haired woman who had been crying quietly throughout Tanya's entire performance was standing now, her expensive dress wrinkled, her mascara ruined, her composure completely shattered. I know she's not lying, Rebecca said, her voice shaking but determined. Because that song, I've heard it before. Preston's face went the color of old chalk. Rebecca, sit down. This isn't— No! She stepped forward, moving toward the center of the room. Tanya sent it to me 2 weeks ago, because she did her research, because she found my name. She turned to address the entire assembled crowd, 500 pairs of eyes fixed on her. My name is Rebecca Moore. 3 years ago, Preston Whitmore told me I was his beautiful secret. Those exact words. When I got pregnant, he gave me $150,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. I signed it. Her voice cracked. I had a miscarriage 3 weeks later. I've never told anyone the truth about what happened. Until tonight. She looked directly at Tanya, who was doubled over in pain, but still listening. When I heard your song, I heard myself. Every single word. Gasps rippled through the ballroom like shockwaves. Another woman stood up. Blonde, mid-30s, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than Tanya's monthly rent. My name is Lauren Mitchell. Her voice was steadier than Rebecca's, but carried the same weight of long-suppressed truth. 2019. Same pattern. You're my beautiful secret. Same NDA. $200,000. Another woman rose. Black, early 40s. Distinguished. Jasmine Howard, 2017. He told me he loved me more than he'd ever loved anyone. His lawyers threatened to destroy my career in arts administration if I ever breathed a word. And another, Latina, 30s, hands trembling at her sides. Diana Torres, 2021. I have a son, Preston's son. He's 3 years old and has no idea who his father is, because I signed an NDA for $200,000 and a promise that they would leave us alone. 4 women standing, 4 separate stories spanning 6 years. Same pattern. Same words. Same beautiful secret. The whispers that had been turning against Tanya reversed direction like a tide changing, and then Rebecca Moore started to sing. You called me your beautiful secret. Her voice wasn't trained like Tanya's. It wavered and cracked on the high notes, but she knew every word. Lauren Mitchell joined in, her soprano harmonizing unexpectedly well. Kept me hidden like a shameful thing, Jasmine Howard added, her alto voice. Diana Torres joined with tears streaming down her face. 14 months of whispered promises. 4 women who had never met before this night. 4 women who had each believed they were alone in their shame and silence. 4 voices joining together on a song that belonged to all of them. And then, despite the contractions ripping through her body, despite the fluid on the floor and the doctor urging her to lie down, Tanya Adams stood up. You can't, the doctor protested. I have to. And she sang. 5 voices became one, a chorus of survivors, a harmony of women who had been silenced and bought and hidden away, finally singing together in a room full of people who could no longer pretend not to hear. I'm not your beautiful secret. The ballroom was absolutely still. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. Victoria Whitmore rose slowly to her feet. Preston. Her voice was cold enough to freeze the champagne in every glass. How many? How many women? Preston looked desperately around the room for support, for allies, for anyone. Mother, this is clearly a coordinated conspiracy to— I am not deaf, Preston. Victoria's composure cracked for the first time in anyone's memory. I just heard 4 women tell the same story, with the same words, across 6 years. She turned to look at Tanya, still singing despite everything. That baby, is that my grandchild? Tanya, through waves of pain. DNA will prove it, but yes. Victoria's face crumpled. I closed my eyes. I knew there were problems, settlements, rumors. And I chose not to look because it was easier. She couldn't finish the sentence. Senator Harold Pemberton stepped forward, his political instincts finally overriding his personal embarrassment. "This wedding is over." "Dad!" Clarissa started. "Enough, Clarissa. I will not let you marry this man, and I will not let my family's name be associated with his." Preston was cornered. His mother had turned. His fiancée's father had canceled the wedding. 4 women were telling the world his secrets. But he wasn't finished. "This is character assassination. They organized this." Tanya, barely standing, supported by Rebecca, cut him off. "We didn't organize anything. We just sang." She looked at him with something like pity. "You invited me here to humiliate me. You wanted to destroy me in front of 500 people. But you forgot something. You can't destroy a voice. And you can't silence the truth when it's being sung." She turned to the room. "I don't have lawyers. I don't have secret recordings. I don't have evidence. I just have my voice and my story. Preston will probably win in court. He has more money than I'll ever see. But he can't unhear what everyone just heard. He can't unsee 4 women stand up and sing the same song. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns don't need lawyers. They prove themselves." Jerome Washington stepped forward. "My name is Jerome Washington, music producer. Before that, investigative journalist." He held up his phone. "This video is going everywhere by morning. Tanya's performance. The 30-second note. The 4 women. Preston Whitmore has lawyers, but the internet doesn't need lawyers." Tanya was being helped onto a gurney now. Before they wheeled her away, she looked at Preston. "You thought you were hiring me to humiliate me. But singing is the only thing I have left. And when that's all you have, you make it count." She closed her eyes as they rolled her toward the door. And as she disappeared, something remarkable happened. A woman from the catering staff started to hum. "You called me your beautiful secret." Another voice joined, and another. The song echoed through the ballroom even after she was gone. Preston stood in the center of his own wedding, alone. 6 months later. No FBI raid. No dramatic arrest. Preston had good lawyers, but he didn't have public opinion anymore. Jerome's video hit 43 million views. The hashtag #HadBeautifulSecret trended for 6 days. 2 million women shared their stories. Whitmore Pharmaceuticals stock dropped 34%. The board forced Preston out. 3 of 4 NDAs were voided, funded with improperly disclosed corporate money. Tanya won an $8 million settlement. Josephine was legally recognized as a Whitmore heir. Preston wasn't in prison. But in his world, what happened was worse. He became nobody. All because of a song. Detroit Medical Center. The night of the wedding. 11:47 p.m. Josephine Adams came into the world screaming, 7 weeks early, but healthy. Her first cry filled the room like a declaration. Tanya, exhausted, held her daughter and laughed through tears. "She's got lungs," Keisha said from beside her. "Her grandmother," Tanya whispered, touching the locket. 3 hours later, there was a knock. Victoria Whitmore stood in the doorway, looking like she'd aged a decade. "May I come in?" Tanya studied her. This woman had sat silently while her son humiliated her, had done nothing. But she had also asked the right question. How many? Tanya nodded. Victoria approached slowly, eyes on the baby. "She's beautiful." Her voice broke. "I'm sorry. For my son. For what he did to you. To all those women. I knew there were problems, rumors, settlements. I chose not to look. That was wrong." Tanya looked at her daughter, then at Victoria. "Sorry doesn't change what happened." "No, it doesn't. But you can change what happens next." Victoria's eyes met hers. "What do you mean?" Josephine deserves to know her family, the good parts. Tanya held her daughter closer. Be a grandmother. A real one. Be present. Victoria's composure broke. Tears streamed down. I will. I promise. Amnam. 1 year later. Billboard Women in Music Awards. Breakthrough Artist, Tanya Adams. Tanya walked onto the stage in gold, her grandmother's locket gleaming. In the front row, Victoria held 1-year-old Josephine, clapping tiny hands. Tanya took the microphone. This album, Beautiful Secret, The Delilah Sessions, was recorded at my father's jazz club, where a man once sat and thought he could own my voice. He couldn't. The song I sang that night, I wrote it alone, in the dark, not knowing if anyone would hear. But 4 women stood up and sang with me. So here's what I want to say. If you have a story to tell it, in your voice, your way. You never know who's listening, or who might stand up and sing with you. Later that night, Delilah's Jazz Lounge. The club had been restored. Victoria had funded it. Tanya walked onto the small stage, the same stage where she'd sung before Preston ever walked through the door. The audience was small. Mama Tony, Keisha, Derek, Rebecca, Lauren, Jasmine, Diana, Victoria with Josephine asleep in her arms. In the corner, where Preston used to sit, an empty chair. Tanya touched her locket. Inside, her grandmother, Josephine, and the folded lyrics. She closed her eyes, and she sang. Preston Whitmore III had $4.2 billion, 17 lawyers, media connections. Tanya Adams had a voice. Preston thought a voice was entertainment, something you could buy, control, silence. He was wrong. A voice, when it carries truth, cannot be silenced, cannot be bought, cannot be turned off. Tanya didn't have evidence for court. No recordings, no investigators. She had a song, and that song was enough, because 500 people heard it, saw 4 women stand up and sing the same words, felt the truth in their bones during those 30 seconds when nobody breathed. That's power money cannot buy. That's the power of a voice. So I have to ask, if you had one song to tell your story, what would you sing about? That note, 30 seconds. Do you think it's possible? Or have you gone back to count? And do you think Victoria deserved forgiveness? She knew. She looked away. Does helping now make up for silence then? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. One more thing, for sharp-eyed viewers. At minute 6, when Tanya touches her locket before singing, look at her lips. She's whispering. That's the lyrics, folded inside the locket. And at minute 12, when the note begins, count it, 30 seconds. But watch Preston's face. Around second 25, he stops looking angry. He starts looking terrified, because he realizes there's nothing he can do. Some things are bigger than money. If this story made you feel something, if you held your breath imagining that note, hit like. Share it with someone who needs to remember their voice matters. Subscribe. This is where underdogs sing and win. See you in the next one.